Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you so very much for joining me. Now most of you know me because I share the experiences of other people online from all across the world. And I'm often asked why I do that. What set me on that path? What set me on that path of being a cryptid and paranormal researcher was seeing a creature in my hometown in 1982 when I was 15. I think now I can speak about it with more confidence than I did back then. I didn't have any answers back then, you know. And I can fill you in a little bit and show you some of the area yourself so you can see it. I was born in a small town called Pendleton in Salford in Manchester. And I lived between Hodge Lane, where my grandparents lived, and Sutton Flats, where my parents lived. And when I was 14, my parents bought a house in Swinton. So I kind of lived between the three properties at that point. I'd done my mocks, and it was that last year at school that you do. I didn't want to go in, I'm going to be honest, so I wagged school. My school was incredibly old, so old that I can't actually find any photographs of the entire building online, but this is half of the building. And then it had an archway that a horse and carriage could go through, and then another part of the building. It was incredibly old. It was built, I think it was a Georgian building. And as I say, there's only half of it left now. It's very, very small. Across the road from that, there's a very famous park called Bewlil Park. And it actually started as two parks, Seedley Park and Bewlil. Bewlil is the original place in the 1500s where many people were buried in a plague pit. So it's always had a little connotation of being a strange place to be. The first house that was built on it was a small wooden building, and that was destroyed in a fire. And I think it was about 100 years later that the mansion that sits there now was actually built. It's been many things in its time. It was originally a family home. It was a much loved mansion, but it's always had bad luck. So it's been a military hospital. It's also been a mining museum of all things, an art gallery, and it was just owned by the council. And by the time I got there, it was left to wreck and ruin. In its heyday, as you see it, it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And it has some very strange stones that sat either side of the front partition, as we called it. And that bit was always been walled off with gates. That was the family's part. And what you see is the servants' quarters, really. And that's where people would, arrive and do business and go. So there used to be a massive greenhouse. It was like an old orangery. And on one side of it had all the tropical plants from all across the world. And on the other side, it was a butterfly house, and it was incredibly hot and warm. So from a young girl from a town who only ever got to go to the countryside at a weekend or on holidays, it's where we went to play. All children in the area played there and still do. There are many, many children that still play at Bewlil Park. Back in its time, it had like a menagerie of animals and all kinds of things. It was a really nice place to go. And I played there quite happily until I was 15. And then everything changed that day. I think it was this time of year, so end of May, getting towards the beginning of June. The weather was very similar today. It was sunny, but it was breezy. It was really nice out. And there used to be a place on Sandy Lane called the Old Dog Entry, and it was a Victorian entryway that went up, old stone steps that went up. It wasn't lit. It was an awful place. And in the daytime, you'd go up it as quick as you could, but at night, you didn't use it. And we used that to go into the park, and that's what we did that day. Next to the old mansion, which by this time was just left to wreck and ruin, there was like old laurel trees and lots of ivy and brambles and just a right mess. Rhododendrons about 40 feet high. And if you tucked in there between the centre of the garden and the mansion, you could see out, but you couldn't see in. And it's the place many of us would go and wag school or skip school. I was there with a friend that day, a good friend. And we stayed friends after it, but there's always been a bit of tension with us about it because of the way I acted, actually. She didn't do anything wrong, I did. We would just lay there laughing and joking, and I was chatting with her and she was chatting with me, and the sun was shining. It was a lovely day. She's probably talking about your club or who fancied what boy or, And I noticed a movement to the corner of my eye. And as I looked, this thing and you're seeing his image now, just leant out of the bushes at me. So leant forward like this and then leant back. But I didn't see him lean back. So the scenario goes, I'm there on the floor and I'm chatting with my friend, and this thing just leans forward like that out of the bushes. And I push my friend to the floor and I'm off screaming. And I turned to see if he was chasing me, and he wasn't. She was running in the opposite direction. And he just melted back into that greenery and he was gone. Absolutely gone. Completely impossible. Should not have happened, but it did. And I have no explanation for it. I was hysterical. I was absolutely hysterical. I run home and I told Mum, and everybody would just kind of convince me that it was a homeless man that I'd seen, but it wasn't a homeless man. He wasn't a man. He wasn't a human man in any way, shape or form. He looked like a man and an ape that had been pushed together, really thick brow ridge, long, very dark brown hair, but obviously I've only seen him this high. And what hair I could see was very, very, very dark brown. But where the sun hit him on his head hair, it was almost like auburn. It was an auburn colour to it, a redness to it. His eyes were the colour of the stone tiger's eye. Or like an amber colour. I wouldn't say orange, but like an amber colour, really. Now, lots of people ask me, what was his ears like? You know, this, that. I don't remember. I remember looking at this part of his face. He had incredibly thick, muscular jaw, incredibly thick brow ridge. His muscles here were really thick. He had normal teeth like you or I. His lips were the same, but on a much bigger scale. He didn't have canines or anything like that. He had normal human teeth. His nose is a bit flattened, like a boxer would, very much like Chris Eubanks, I realised in later years. And he just looked like a monster. I've always called him the Man Ape because that's what he looked like. He looked like a man and an ape combined, and he was awful. He was absolutely awful. And that was it for me. I'd suffered paranormal events as a child, very early on, as a child and throughout my early years. But that event was the be all and end all for me. I think I shut myself down at that point. I was absolutely terrified. I thought he was going to follow me home and he'd know where I lived. And when I was going up the stairs at night, he'd be able to see me through the window, you know, and he'd come and get me when my parents were asleep. I didn't know if Mum and Dad knew about him and they were lying to me and just saying that nothing like that existed. And that was frightening. But also, what if they didn't know that something like that existed? Then I was on my own, and that was even more frightening. And unfortunately, that was my reality then for the next 30 years. And that's the truth. That's how long it took me to actually go onto camera and speak about my experience. It was incredibly traumatic. I made all of the mistakes that trauma makes you make. I went with the wrong man. I drank. I did whatever I could to blank that incident from my mind. And I was probably manic for 25 years. I've had every diagnosis under the sun. And now at 57, I know there's nothing wrong with me. There was absolutely nothing wrong with me. I had an experience at 15 that I can't explain. And the burden of proof was put squarely on my shoulders. Now, if you see a ghost, nobody asks you who that ghost is, what his name on when he's alive, where did he come from, what did he eat, what was his job. You saw a ghost and that's accepted. If you have an experience with ET or a flying craft or something like that, nobody asks you what that craft was made of, how was it engineered, what was the being made of, where did he come from, what was his species, what did he eat, where did he sleep, how did he make love. I've had every person I've ever come into contact with from being 15 to now expect me to have all of those answers. And that's why I interview people about traumatic experiences that they've had at any part in life. You can go 70 years and not have an experience, and suddenly you have an experience. And I haven't met anybody yet that didn't have the same questions as me. And normally they ask me, well, has ever anybody else in your area ever seen him? And the answer to that is yes. Lots of people have seen him in my area in the same place. I was incredibly lucky. About 30 years after, when I was a known researcher and people knew my name, there was a chap called Thomas Markham who got in touch with me from America. And he runs the blog, The Crypto Crew. So he did my sighting report and he put it out there in his blog. And it was months after, quite a long time after. I was working at home and I got a message from him on Facebook, and it was like, "Hi Deb, have a look at this." And I saw a Bigfoot report in Lancashire. So I presumed it was mine. I thought he'd done a redo on mine, because obviously at that point I think I'm the only person. So I thought, I'll put it aside and I'll have my tea and I'll go and read it. And he must have seen me look at it and go away. And he went, "No, Deb, you need to look at it." So I opened it, and you can see it here. And it was a lady named Brenda from my hometown who saw him 2 years after me. She was walking her dog. It was January for her, about 5:30 in the afternoon, so it would be dark by that time. And there are street lights next to the stable block. There was an old Victorian street light there, and he was standing there. And she said he looked like a chimp and a man combined. He was completely covered in hair. He had a pot belly, and he was kind of hunched over, kind of like this. And she's similar description to mine. She said he had a piggy nose. It was kind of flat, and you could see his nostrils. He had a normal human mouth kind of thing, and he had male genitalia, and she saw that quite clearly. It was only 20 years before that a man in the 1970s had seen what he described as a hairy man chasing a fox on the golf course there outside the mansion. 20 years before that, there was a man that worked for the parks and recreations, and he was walking to work one day, and there used to be a lake actually in Bewley, and he said that he was coming through Light Oaks and he saw a chimp that was down at the stream cupping water and drinking it in his hand. I then went on to find lots of other people. There was a lady there who was at the banqueting hall, and she had eaten something and she had anaphylactic shock, and they'd taken her outside to wait for the ambulance. And at this point, she's lay over a car with just a friend there, and her friend's looking around for panic. And she said this grey hairy thing just looked out of the bushes at her and gone. He was gone. And that was it. He was gone. And then we had 4 gentlemen. Jade got in touch with me. She was one of the gentlemen's wives. And she said that they were on the golf course at Ellesmere, which is walkable from the park. It's not that far at all. And they were testing out some Father's Day gear, 4 of them. And they saw something in the rough that they presumed was somebody coming to steal from them. So being 4 handy lads, they set off to march, and this thing comes out of the woodland at them. And they said it was gesticulating like that with its hands, as if it was trying to tell them to go away. And without thinking, they all stepped forward again. And as they did that, it screamed. And an answering scream came from that direction. And when they looked back, it had gone. It had just completely gone. And then less than 18 months later, another gentleman made a report when he was out with his son in Drinkwater Park. There were 2 reports in 2020 and 2021 of a strange dark figure that was seen in the park. Now, these could be separate things, or they could be connected. I don't know. That's why I take the stories and I map them so we know what's going on in the area. And if you're new to this channel, you'll see coming forward that we just chat with people about their trauma and what happened to them that day. And we try and look back in their family history, or we look at the land, or we'll do a kind of investigation that not many people out there are doing. There are lots of investigation teams that could go into Bewley and use an EVP or, whatever tech that they've got, and that's great. Won't change anything for me, and it won't change anything for all those witnesses. What we need to look at is the DNA of the witness. Is there a family line of experiences? Have grandparents or great-grandparents experienced a UFO, seen a ghost, had a knowing, suffer from deja vu, that kind of thing? And we can say, it might be in your family line. Is there a connection with that person to that land? I played in that land here's a photo with my dad, when my dad put me on a bench when I was tiny. We used to go there all the time. And then when I went back 53 years later, I'm on that same bench. I'm connected to that park, as are my family members. My dad had his own experience where I walked up the dog entry. My dad, many years before in the 70s, had seen something at the bottom of that entry. And he described it as a thick black wolf that had yellow eyes. So, is there a family connection? I don't know. I'm not really sure. And I don't know if I'll get my answers. But I would like to keep searching for other people and help them get their answers. Another question people ask me is, how do you find these witnesses, Deb? Well, now they find me. I have quite an online presence. People know me. I have social media. But back then, in 1982, there was no internet. There was nothing like that. You couldn't go to Google and say, you know, what's 7.5 foot tall, looks like a Neanderthal. That was probably the only name I knew back then, would be Neanderthal or troglodyte. I remember looking for that. Because he wasn't a caveman, and he wasn't a monkey, and he wasn't a gorilla, he wasn't any of those things. So I didn't know what to look for. So I thought the library. And in Peel Park, which is the next park along, same situation, old mansion house, creepy at night. People say, don't go in there, you'll see the gorilla man. I wonder if it's the same gorilla man. They have a huge library with archives going back, you know, centuries. So I went there, off I went, you know, 2p on the bus back then. Got on the bus at Sutton and got off at Peel Park. And for anyone who lives in Salford, I was smiling at there. Into the library I go, you know, 15. Had a bit of brass in my pocket even then. And I said to the lady, right, I'm doing some research for a project at school. And I want to know if you got any books on early man or caveman that are still alive in the UK today. And she said, oh, yeah. And I thought, oh, thank God for that. My prayers have been answered. She's going to explain everything to me. And I can walk away from here today and that's it. I never have to think about it again. I'm already weird enough. I don't need any adding on. And she came back and handed me Stig of the Dump. And Stig of the Dump, for anybody who doesn't know, is a fictional story written about a young boy who goes on holiday to his grandparents' house and he sees a caveman in a dump. So great and all of that. So I knew I was on my own at that point and I'd have to start looking myself. So that's what I did. I hit the CB radio, I wrote to newspapers, radio stations, anywhere that I could in the UK to find other people who'd seen the awful, upright, hairy thing that I saw, hoping that they'd be able to tell me that it was an escaped animal or something. But it never worked out like that. But if that day hadn't have happened, then BBR wouldn't have happened and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. So, yeah, that's what happened to me in 1982. Make of it what you will. But that's my story. Next time we chat, I'll tell you what it was like coming forward in the UK as a woman in the forces in society, and just how hard it was and how many doors I had to kick down or kick through to just get my story out there and look for help and look for answers. It shouldn't be that hard for anybody. And that was another part of the reason that I do what I do today. Nobody should maybe made to feel like they have to break down a door just to share their truth with somebody.